Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone, and all those who are here or those who are watching us online for this 2022 Rencontre économique d'Aix session. We are going to talk about earmarking savings for growth. Great topic for Sunday morning. It's like the topic of work for the baccalaureate. It seems like what we used to see yesterday when we had an economic manual that told us that saving is creative because it enables us to invest in production and it supports economic growth. But since Jean-Baptiste said, savings used to enable the production of the presentation of productive equity. But things have changed. This was the world of yesterday. And now we don't know so much what we're talking about, whether in terms of savings or growth. In terms of savings, let me remind you of a few things. Today, the savings ratio of French people is very high, up to 20% of available income during the COVID crisis, and we're over 10%, which is high since the 80s. But in the meantime, the GDP has gone up and down, -8%, +7%, and now down at the beginning of the years with the Ukraine war. And it seems that we would have a growth of 2.3% for 2022, according to predictions. In the meantime, we remember that a few months ago we were discovering the world of negative rates. This made us lose our ideas about the appetite for risk. There was quite a few bubbles on certain assets and certain sectors, and today the rates are up again. In this context, savers are at a loss. They must look for a return and some safety because there's a multiplication of risks. History will judge this period at economic level, but there's been quite a few upheavals at macroeconomic level in a few months, and we would need to have a long-term view to try and earmark savings. But nevertheless, the world is very uncertain. Talking about the growth of funding, we no longer know what we're talking about. Things were simple when growth was reduced to the evolution of GDP. Earmarking savings for growth, okay, but what growth? The issue of sustainable growth and decarbonation of our economy are ever more of the essence, which means that savings and asset management must be greened. In practice, we've seen clear development of socially responsible investment and of CSR for companies. We have to note that things are not stable, far from it. According to the latest news at financial level, there's been quite a lot of controversies about the ISR and the labels and commitments. Savings for sustainable growth is not necessarily a must. Talking about the funding of a real economy with quantitative easing, the policy of central banks has led to an explosion of monetary mass and the quantity of cash, circulating cash. So some elements have been positives. We have avoided the credit crunch of 2008, have had a highly dynamic capital investment, but in the same time, we've had problems with assets and with quite a lot of impact on growth and employment. With the various recovery plans, the public authorities have intervened massively in the funding of the economy and that of corporations, and the program of investment for the future, France 2030, is mobilizing savings for decarbonation, health innovation, digital sovereignty, and the training for tomorrow's jobs. In total, 50 billion euros will be mobilized in the coming years with the support of operators such as the Caisse des Dépôts or BPI France. But these various strong movements have shown a stronger decorrelation between savings and companies' funding. To sum up, savings is out of sync. There's an increase in responsible savings and deregulating of the cash flows. There are quite a few bubbles, some recession, and a decorrelation with sustainable growth. More than ever, we need to fund the transformation of the economy and the energy transition and environmental transition. And for that, we need the people around this table to fund tomorrow's world and invent new and more sustainable balances at economic and ecological level. So with these upheavals, our jobs, our financial system are also challenged, and we can wonder what would be the priority targets for earmarking savings for growth. What are the roles that the financial stakeholders can play vis-à-vis public authorities in order to aim for sustainable growth? What goals must we try to attain? And this is what our guests are going to try and answer, and that's a major challenge, I must say. So we have 6 guests. Manu Bashkaran, CEO of Centennial Asia Advisors and Vice President of the Economic Society of Singapore. This is the institution that helped us organize the Rencontre d'économiques Index in Asia. He will tell us about the high savings rate in Asia and the key role of intermediary institutions in resources. Then online we will have Prakash Kannan, director of a sovereign fund from Singapore called GIC. So we'll see him on the screen, and he'll tell us about the economic, ecological, and energy transition is being more and more invested into in Asia. Prakash.
Show us how a significant amount of money are invested in Asia in the energy and ecological transition. Claire Chabrier, qui est présidente de France Invest.
Claire Chabrier, chairman of France Invest, who will tell us about the role of capital investment in France for sustainable growth, for decarbonation, diversity, and innovation. Bertrand Rambaud, chairman of CIPAREX, a very early investment fund who were really precursors. He'll tell us how we can act on the French, in France, as close as possible to the savers. Emmanuel Goldstein, director, CEO of Morgan Stanley France. He'll tell us about their products and how they try to give access to the new savers to tomorrow's economy. And Tim Collins, founder and CEO of Ripplewood Advisors, he'll tell us how things are changing and bankers are changing as well, and how the partnership with companies can take place. Manu Bashkaran, over to you.
With your minute, you have your famous 6 minutes to introduce your
Thank you, and very good morning, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here today. I will speak from the perspective of an economist who's observed the trends in East and Southeast Asia and the role that savings played in funding the investment that resulted in a dramatic economic transformation. So my perspective will be very top-down from the macro level, looking at the savings trends. The key lesson that we have learned is that the macroeconomic and political ecosystems need to be conducive to incentivize savings. With a high savings rate, a high investment rate can be financed without the country running into external difficulties that produce currency crises or other kinds of financial shocks. And that is what then allows for high and transformative economic development. So the question is, what is the ecosystem that will help to create that kind of productive savings? I'd say a few things. One is a stable policy environment so that savers feel confident about keeping their money aside. The money will not be lost. The first requirement is political stability. And by this, I don't mean that there should be no changes of government. There are countries in Southeast Asia that have had frequent changes of government, but the policy environment, the ideological approach of the government remained the same. So savers felt assured that there would be no political dislocations, no sudden changes of policy or ideology that would undermine their savings value. By and large, most of East and Southeast Asia have met this condition, and that is why we've had high savings rates there. The next requirement has been a stable macroeconomic environment, and the key to this is really that the economies of the region kept inflation rates low, both at an absolute level, but also relative to their trading partners and their competitors. This ensured that their currencies did not come under pressure and that you had minimal currency-related disruptions that would then undermine the confidence of savers. Third, it is also important that governments contribute to savings. For example, in Singapore and Malaysia, there is a strict rule in fiscal management. Budgets are designed so that there is no deficit on the current account of the budget. In other words, the current revenues will fund all the current spending, things like wages and pensions and social spending. If there is a deficit, it is only on the capital account, which is the investment budget. So in a technical sense, by ensuring that current revenues cover current expenditure, governments are contributing to national savings, and that helps stabilize the system. Separately, another pillar of a sound ecosystem is the robustness of the financial architecture. It's interesting that we are meeting almost exactly 25 years after the beginning of the Asian financial crisis in July 1997. That crisis taught the countries of that region, East and Southeast Asia, some very hard lessons. And since then, there's been a tremendous effort to improve the banking system in terms of its structure, supervision, capitalization. So for instance, Indonesia, which suffered the crisis the worst, today has capital adequacy ratios for its biggest banks that are among the highest in the world, and that has lent a tremendous amount of stability to the system. Capital markets play a lower profile in that part of the world, but the importance is growing, and this is really important to achieve because you need that diversity in the financial architecture. Well-regulated capital markets are needed to be further developed in the region. We don't have the same level of participation in capital markets of pension funds, insurance funds, and other related institutions. And so our bond and equity markets still remain relatively underdeveloped compared to France, Europe, and the West. So there's a big effort to promote capital market development. And in countries like Malaysia, for instance, there's been a tremendous progress in developing the bond market, but less so in other parts of the region. Malaysia has also taken the lead in developing Islamic finance so that the more devout citizens of that country can also participate in the financial system. So what is my conclusion? With these ingredients in place, there's a better chance that we achieve the high investment rates needed for rapid economic growth, and to fund it in such a way through high savings that the entire economy is sustainable and does not run into crises or shocks or financial stresses of any kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manu. It's fascinating how it works in Asia. Prakash, can you hear us? And can you show us
yes, I can.
how transforming the economy is made in ecology and green is impacting the investments as well in Asia?
No, thank you very much. I I apologize for not being there in person. 6 months ago, I was really looking forward to kind of more physical meetings, but then now I'm faced with the problem of having too many competing physical meetings. So I'm actually calling you from India at the moment, where I'm attending another conference. But really, thank you to the organizers for the invitation. So for my intervention, for those of you who don't know, GIC is one of Singapore's sovereign wealth funds. So I will speak from the position of an institutional investor. I think what you will hear from the rest of the panel is really kind of different ways in which to mobilize finance, mobilize savings actually for growth. What I'm going to focus on is actually where those savings can go to, and I think it is without a doubt that the biggest challenge for growth, in fact, for the entire world, if you will, is really this transition to net zero. I think most of you must have heard some of the numbers, but if we just focus on this net zero transition, the scale of investments that are needed in low emissions, climate resilient infrastructure is huge. The International Economic Agency estimates about 6 trillion US dollars of green capital expenditures that's going to be required globally over the next decade on an annual basis to support this transition, the infrastructure needs, clean water, etc. So in my intervention today, I'll just make 2 points. The first one is on the need and the importance of supporting transition finance. I think there is a danger in the investment industry right now that tends to approach investing in kind of ESG practices in a very black and white manner. Um, for example, we were investing in a coal plant in the Philippines, um, and the company had a very credible transition plan to go from 100% coal generating right now to be actually 100% renewable by 2030. But it was having such a difficult time attracting finance because nobody wanted to touch a coal company in this current environment. But instead, we went in and we said, look, we're going to help you make that transition. And we think that by engaging companies and actually helping them do this, at the end of the day, we just have a much bigger impact on the real economy. Because if you think about it, if the entire financial industry went to net zero tomorrow, which is possible by buying carbon offsets, this doesn't really help the real economy transition to net zero. So I think there is a tendency for investors to mechanically divest themselves from certain sectors. And I think it's not really helpful as it just passes on the problem to whoever is buying the asset and not really helping at the end of the day what we want to try and achieve, which is to decarbonize the economy. So the first point I would make is really, I think that it's a much better model to try and engage companies and help them make that transition to cleaner, more sustainable models. The second point I would make is that there's a very important role for governments, I think, in this process. And of course, Manu just talked about providing macro stability, which I think is important. But on the specific green transition, I would make two things. I think the first one is on formulating strategy. And I think at a big picture level, a lot of the net zero commitments that economies have made is a really great thing. I mean, I'm in India right now, and I think India's pledge at COP26 to be net zero by 2070, has been phenomenal. And it's really kind of helped catalyze the direction of private savings towards these specific areas. But we can get more granular than that. So going back to India, they've also launched a national hydrogen mission where they're really trying to accelerate plans to generate hydrogen from renewables by 2047. So I think kind of being more specific about the strategy, and in fact sometimes bringing the dates closer, I think that really helps catalyze and helps direct private investment towards the areas that the government is willing to push. The second one, I think, is that with some investments in new technologies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, it's actually useful for the government to also help taking early stage development risk. This can be through a development fund. Obviously at the European level, you also have the European Investment Bank, and I think these kinds of better risk allocation mechanism where the government takes a more subordinated stake in some of these enterprises, perhaps first loss or even other forms of guarantees. I think these can help crowd in private capital because many of these projects will be first of a kind, and they will require a lot more support before scaling up happens and the kind of economies of scale kick in. So I think that the government's playing that role to try and give a good support, I think would be very helpful. So let me stop my intervention here, and happy to take questions later.
Thank you very much, Prakash. I think it's a huge amount for a huge cause, and we will certainly come back with the questions later. Claire, donc présidente de France Invest, est-ce que vous pouvez nous...
Claire, Chairman of France Invest, can you tell us a bit how things take place on this side? Well, yes, good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be with you today. So earmarking savings for growth, this is what the stakeholders in capital investment do every day, and it's my honor to represent them today together with Bertrand. France Invest represents 400 management companies in the field of investment in infrastructure, private debt in France. We act as a relay between savings and real economy as we support startup companies, SMEs, and ETIs. And in France, the members of France Invest support 9,000 companies throughout our territory. Our job is to fund with equity and for the long term those entrepreneurs who have good ideas for development. So we collect and then we invest these savings in the real economy. If we look at the state of our industry today, people don't always know it, but in Europe, capital investment in 2021 represents 138 billion euros of investment, 25 for France. And if I take private debt and infrastructure at the same time, it means 50 billion euros of investment in 2021 in the industry, goods and services, consumption goods, health, and the digital market. In France, this has doubled in size. The companies we support are growing faster than the average, as the average growth is 2.5 times higher than that of the general economy in France. And this growth means job creations, 250,000 net job creations over the past 5 years, and companies which are not only around Paris, but also in the rest of France, because 50% of our companies are outside the Paris area. Obviously, these companies will continue growing, will be faced with a lot of challenges, as we heard over the past 2 days, which are greater. They have to continue attracting the right talents, and all this in a context of climate emergency, but we'll come back to that. So it's like running a marathon like you were running 100 meters, and that's not easy. So these companies have those challenges I was mentioning, and the issue is to see how we can continue turning these savings into growth in the context of these new challenges. Let me mention two major of these challenges. We've been talking about climate for the past 2 days. There are massive stakes there. We have to support these companies in their decarbonation process. Let me remind you that for France, it means an investment of 60 billion a year, mainly in equity. And this is a long-term investment, long-term support. It's true for companies, but it's true for their financial partners, i.e. us. It's true for states. And we will have to mobilize savings in the right direction. So there's the issue of funding, but there's also the issue of support, because we will have to support these companies. And there are small companies there. We hear a lot. The major corporations talk about this topic, but it's a much more complex topic for medium-sized companies, SMEs, very small companies. And they no longer not necessarily know how to go about it, and we have to support them. So we have to be vigilant altogether so that we don't leave anyone along the road, and so that we don't see a divide created between the major corporations that are speeding up and these small companies. The second challenge we're facing, obviously, to face the climate challenge is innovation. The stakeholders in capital investment are supporting innovation and will continue to do so, because we wouldn't be able to face the challenge of climate otherwise. We have to invest in deep tech, agri-tech. All this is essential if we want to continue transforming, and it means a massive investment. For companies to transform quickly, we have to support them, as I was saying. But for all this to work and to succeed, we need a number of prerequisites. We will have to mobilize, and this is the topic today, we'll have to mobilize more savings. This is a challenge, honestly. To give you an idea of what's taking place in France, we're presently speeding up, but as we were saying by way of introduction, today the savings of French citizens is not very much directed towards the real economy. It gets bad returns. When we look at the long-term savings, like savings in pension or the employee participations, it's not invested in the real economy, as only 0.1% is invested in the real economy, while it would make sense to invest it in companies and the long-term support of these companies. We tend to say that French people are risk adverse and that they like cash, which is not the right thing when you talk about capital investment, which is a long-term investment. But we see that things are moving somewhat and accelerating. Distributors are accelerating. All the stakeholders of capital investment are trying to do so, and it's our job today to give access to more private citizens to this category of assets that make more sense. So we have to show them the value and share this value with the private citizens and savers. This is our objective, and we want to share it also with even more with all the stakeholders, and in particular with employee savings. This is what we do at France Invest. We want to share this value with all the wage earners, and we will manage to do so if we manage to streamline the whole value chain and share the growth. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Claire, pour cette vision.
Thank you, Claire, for this broad vision of what is happening in France and what has happened. So, in a more limited view, now it's your turn, Bertrand. Claire has said a lot of things already. Thank you. Hello to everyone. I think that over these last 2 days, we've heard a lot about the notion of common good. Pierre-Philippe was saying yesterday, and Claire, he was saying that there was a lack of economic culture from our citizens. And alongside this, and we've heard it a lot, there are a lot of transformations in our companies, which is very significant. Some people were also saying that capital is the mother of all battles, but also it's actually what is most crucial. And we have to work together on common stakes, on earmarking savings via private equity and capital investments. That's actually one answer. It's not the only one, of course, that actually gives some yield. But it's also good for companies because they are in something concrete. And in this way, they can actually be in transformations. And the young people want to see it. And at this time, we actually have a U-turn. There are conditions for this to work. We need to make sure that these savers can invest in funds where also large institutional funds can go. We actually often create products. It's not the first time that we actually look into individual investment, and you have a lot of fiscal arrangements, but the expected outcomes were not always there. So we have to deregulate everything, and actually the impact actually is going into this direction. There were a lot of good things, and we are at a point where we are in perfect alignment of interests to attract savings like this and also companies. It's 50 years old. It's been funded by institutionals, by family offices. Now it should open to individual savings. How do we do that? There are tools, but there are also the underlyings. I'm not going. It's 9:30 on a Sunday, so I'm not going to be too technical. But there are two small examples because that's actually the subject matter. There's a product that we should all have, and a lot of us are doing it. That's feeders. What is a feeder? It's actually an investment vehicle created by banks, attracting people that invest 100Ks, and they are then invested in institutional funds where private equity operators are managing them for companies. That works. It's actually dozens of millions of euros every year, and that will actually open up investments for those that would not normally be eligible to them. There are other funds. There's also life insurance. There's also pension savings. There are actually a lot of tools. There's a wide array of tools. It depends on the risk adversity, or it depends also on the estate. But we can actually do customized product depending upon what the investor wants to do. There was a very nice initiative that was launched by BIP France 2-3 years ago. On the secondary market, there were funds in which they invested, and they gave the opportunity to physical people to become investors of their own funds by investing 100Ks. It was quite smart, and it worked quite well. And if you want to have a vehicle that would be present, let's take the example of Siparec in the Rhône-Rhône-Alpes region. We can do it to be in SMEs, to be in middle market companies as well. If you want to be in the energy market, you can also do it and invest in energy transition companies. The French operators of private equity can do it. And if you are audacious and you're attracted by the Web3, we don't talk about cryptocurrency anymore, then we can offer it with all the risks that are attached to it. All this to tell you that it's moving. We can do customized offers, and it works. With the minute that I have left, actually, I have to say that it's not a magic wand. There are actually stakes behind it. I will mention 4. It's very good to ensure individual savings, but there's the matter of liquidity, because they're often long investments, so we have to improve ourselves in terms of regulations for those that want to get out, that they can get out. And secondly, it's also fees and charges, because we know that it's costly to distribute these products. And we have a collective responsibility between the shareholders, the CGP, the bankers, to limit the fees, to make sure that the individual performance be as close as possible to that of an institutional investor. That is essential. We have to highlight this point. This is our responsibility towards the private individuals. And third point is also the increase of rates. We'll see what impact it will have, even if the actual rate remains negative. We still have key interest rates that are going up, so we'll see what kind of impact we'll have. And then we'll have a real responsibility, what kind of client we want to have for that type of product. Of course, it's wide, but it's a long-term product, which is quite volatile, which has cycles, and it's a matter of insiders as well. So we have to inform the client, and it's also the responsibility of the managers and issuers to distribute this product. So we have an exceptional environment. We are really in line with the history, but we need the regulations to help us fine-tune this. But I think the individual savings will definitely help us in the future. And it will certainly support and assist everything that we are living today and that was told over these last 2 days. Thank you, Bertrand. We can see that there's actually a lot of questions, a lot of issues, and we definitely want to answer. So, Emmanuel, how about the banks? Well, we're doing quite well. I'm very happy to try to answer partly to this and to try to complement what was said earlier. I would like to make 2 remarks, because as a liberal, I could say, why don't we let the market go on its own and let customers go towards the products that they want. But we have inducement products to orient, to guide some of the savings towards technological breakthrough investments. That's the first remark. Secondly, to reinforce what was said earlier by Claire, we have to guide savings towards equities, because we are generally going towards bonds, livret A, savings, or non-risk, but we shouldn't go towards this, because otherwise we won't have enough private equity. We should make a distinction between the institutional investors and the individual investors. The institutional ones, and we've seen it with Raquel, which represents one of the greatest sovereign funds, with GIC, for instance, that is represented everywhere. For them to want to invest in France, we need to have an interesting framework. We need to let them know as well what are the investment supports that exist. We create also investments that expose them to the French economy, and we need to have companies that would develop and where they can invest. And this is key. But all in all, these professional investments have an allocation strategy, and once we enable them to invest in the right companies from our national or local fabric, then they can be there. It's important to make sure that they are there, to have actually a French forefront, because these large institutional investors, otherwise they would only invest in a marginal well, and if there is a problem, then they will fall back to their basics elsewhere. And we need to create an ecosystem with inducements, with investment teams set up. It's very important structurally to make sure that institutional investments be guided towards France. If we talk about individual investors and how to make them go towards risky investments, then we have brands that are important. Rasio, Morgan Stanley is a brand. Even if we actually don't do much branding with it, we also have a lot of retail. Morgan Stanley throughout the world is 7,000 billion assets under management. We distribute them everywhere. We have shelves everywhere. In the US, for instance, that's our greatest market. So we have some shelves where we distribute products that go towards France as well. We develop in France as well to offer structured products that are resold under other brands or under a white brand, namely BNP Asset Management and others. And we will invest in Morgan Stanley that has been structured in another way. So how can we structure things so that investors do not have the impression that they are punished because they want to take risks? So, of course, there are risks and rewards. There's no secret. A secret where there would be only rewards is actually a Ponzi scheme, nothing else. So, how can we do that? if we look for important vehicles for savings, it's actually life insurance in France, where we have the funds in euro. This is where we have the remuneration, which is not a fixed rate, but it is actually pre-established in a mechanic way. So it looks like a livret savings account, but that doesn't go towards growth economy. And then we have account units. So how can we go from one vehicle to the other? We have techniques that induce things, that facilitate things. So in a fund, we can have, in savings funds, we can have a percentage of savings on the one side, and then we go to account units elsewhere. We can have also 9G, where we reward more the parts that is in the savings if the proportion put in the growth fund is higher. And then, as a few tools, I'm going to talk about them for the 30 seconds. Then we need to have ISR, ESG, and we need to have accessible tools. And this is why I pay tribute to the BPI investment, because not everyone can invest so much money. And if we can actually lower it, it's also a matter of liquidity. We have Euronext that has created a new segment to make sure that the growth tools with quoting systems that are easier, so we can have more access, to have more liquidity for the shareholders. That was actually an important point. At one point, we need to be able to get our savings back if we need to. And then if we want to have an attractive banking place, it's incumbent upon all the stakeholders. We are at a mature market. We all want to have an ecosystem on the French banking center as a whole, so as to point towards growth. Thank you very much. Oof, this is a wonderful debate. It seems that there's a lot of input. Tim, it's up to you now.
I'm not really used to this. I'm actually usually pretty shy. So I'm going to be unapologetically American, although I spend less time there since Trump was elected, and I spend more time here. So let me just quickly say I have comments in two basic categories. Number one, what are the conditions precedent for a robust and effective allocation of savings in a just fashion? And two, what are some of the tools to facilitate this process? I'm not an economist or a politician, so I'm just going to be provocative instead. Two critical impediments to economic and social flourishing are inflation and the general trust deficit. Inflation is in both goods and assets is not only distorts allocation of capital away from its highest and best use, it also harms those least able to withstand the pain, and very importantly, it frightens investors and increases the great economic disease, which is uncertainty. Paul Volcker, who is a very dear friend of mine, makes me hesitate to say anything about monetary policy or inflation. But Paul cured inflation, but at a very, very high cost for society. I don't believe that the best way to cure inflation is to put the entire burden of controlling inflation on central banks. As far as I can tell, there are two ways to reduce inflation. One, reduce demand, and that is probably to create a recession, as Paul did, and high unemployment. Or two, increase productivity and therefore increase supply and reduce unit costs. Since the second alternative is not usually a quick fix, society must protect the most vulnerable from the short-term impact of inflation. Increasing productivity is at the core of properly utilizing the wealth of a nation, and I will speak briefly about that in a second. The second condition to a flourishing economy is trust. Economies and societies rely on trust in both individuals and institutions. The tax on society of mistrust is enormous and corrosive. It distorts behavior, markets, without making any judgment about the robustness of Bitcoin or NFT use cases. The recent carnage in these markets is an unusual case, a combination of mistrust. The original flight to these assets was driven by mistrust in traditional institutions, and the recent crash was caused by a huge fear that the new assets and institutions were even less trustworthy. In any case, In any case, there has been a massive cost, and an even greater cost of this trust deficit can be seen in the political world. How much energy is wasted in chaos and attacks rather than collaboration for common goals? The most glaring example, as most of you have discussed, is the tragedy of the global response to climate change, which is a generational tragedy and shocking in terms of the quality of the debate. It's beyond my mandate to even attempt a prescription for this terrible cancer on society. I will say, however, that I have not lost hope in our ability to create institutional legitimacy and civil discourse. Now, briefly, the stuff that I'm really supposed to talk about, the tools that can harness your incredible savings to create a fair and more flourishing society. They're very, on this I can be very brief. Productivity is the critical element. There are three ways to enhance productivity: better allocate capital, innovate and develop life-enhancing products and services, or three, organize government, business, and labor to reduce frictional costs and maximize collaboration. In my view, France and much of Europe have done a better job than the U.S. of using the banking system to support businesses, especially SMEs. However, much, much more can be done. 40 years ago, a U.S. banker was a partner and advisor to customers, not just a lender or a savings manager. The cost of this type of personal service is now prohibitive for SMEs. The future is using technology to add value to customers as well as better allocate capital. And I think in almost all big economies, SMEs are the critical driver of future growth and stability. We have a small bank in the Baltics where we've trademarked SME in a box, and we've made an early start on this process. SMEs are the backbone for both the U.S. and the French economies. If they flourish, the nations flourish. Innovation is always mentioned and rarely debated. It's almost always a good thing. The perennial question is how. There are 1,000 studies that attempt to answer this question. I wouldn't presume to attempt a comprehensive answer. However, I believe there are two general principles that I find persuasive. Number one is focus. Major innovations arise from intense individual and institutional focus. JFK focused on the moon, and NASA made it happen. Jeff Bezos had a fanatical focus on customer experience, and he prevailed. If a nation wants to spur innovation, relentless focus is required. And two is collaboration between government, the private sector, and the academy. DARPA, the Manhattan Project, the Moonshot, ENIAC, and the support of Harold Brown for the U.S. semiconductor industry, all involved intense collaboration between all three areas. On a broader level, coordination, if not collaboration, between government, business, and labor can unlock enormous productivity. The combination of Dwight Eisenhower's Interstate Highway Program and pattern bargaining between automotive manufacturers and unions created the flourishing middle class that lasted until the mid-'80s. This required powerful and inspirational leaders, and both Eisenhower and Walter Reuther come to mind. I'm over time. Thanks.
You're just in time. It's perfect.
I didn't have anything else to say anyway.
Thank you very much, Tim. It was
Merci.
to much larger questions as well. Je pense qu'on va...
I think we will try to have a debate because this is actually the subject matter of this session. I actually would like to thank you for all your inputs. These are actually gigantic challenges that we will have to face. May it be actually a small saver or large ones. It will require a responsibility, a significant responsibility from the states, the institutions, in the implementation of all this, because as you say, we have been talking about it for some time, but now we have to walk the talk. Would anyone have a question? Yeah? Thank you very much. I would like to go back to the topic of the debate, because I've listened to all of you. You've talked about how to earmark savings for growth, but I really haven't understood the most efficient way to have the best allocation of savings for growth. If there were something to do, as Mr. Tim Collins, the intersection between territories, governments, and financial institutions, or if there was something else that would be more efficient. Thank you. Thank you. I will let the panelists answer. There is a correlation that exists. That's my feeling. Maybe I'm talking about France 2030, which is the program that I'm chairing, but I think that the state has taken over this system and invested a lot of money. 53 billion euros were to be deployed by 2030 on sectors for growth that have been identified. It's not everywhere. Priorities have been determined. There are 17 of them, and they are pretty straightforward. And now we have to deploy, implement all this under the aegis of the public authorities, but not only, because it won't only be a matter of state expenditure. Other partners will be at stake as well. And to follow up on this, we at France Invest, we actually align with what you're doing with your program in terms of subjects and sectors of investment. We are acting as a leverage, as a driver for these investments for the 2030 program. When we talk about 50 billion, this is what we invest every year. And with a large diversity of subjects of investment, in maybe at the start of companies, startups for innovation purposes, but also we invest in SMEs and middle market companies as well. So I think we should continue acting and playing this role. What we observe, what we can see, is that the earmarking of this these savings is speeding up because investors have become the second subscriber of capital investment. It has been said a lot, and all the stars are aligned. We all go into the same direction, may it be for distribution, for managers. We all going towards this subject matter. Do you all feel that you have a bigger collective responsibility and a better collaboration between all of you? Is that the case in the US and in Asia, in France? Challenges are so large that awareness has been raised now, and everybody has understood that they should take on responsibility together, and that the responsibility is different from before. I think there's a huge responsibility, a huge collective responsibility on this subject. It's a matter of small things. On a daily basis, we support companies in their value chain. This is what we do as capital investment. And what is changing today is that our responsibility lies on energy transition, everything that we've mentioned over the last 2 days. And we also have a huge responsibility towards the saver. That's important because when we have an institutional coming, it's his job. But when we have a private individual, it's very important to feel really responsible towards them. We need to make sure that they win money, that they earn money, and that they find also extra financial criteria. So that's how our trade has changed. And we can see it among the 300 members of France Invest. But it goes beyond France. This is actually worldwide. Manu, maybe a second for each of you to wrap up.
Just 2 points. I think the savings industry no longer serves the interests of its ultimate client, the small chap trying to save for his retirement or for his children's education. The kind of distortions you see in the financial system, the herding behavior, the bunching of all investments into a few large companies to the detriment of investment in other small companies, these don't help the ultimate saver. So you need reforms to the capital markets in order to alleviate that. Second thing is the structure of the industry. In Japan, in Germany, for instance, you have specialized financial institutions that serve small, medium-sized enterprises, and that's one reason why those economies are so successful. I think we've lost some of this in many of the other economies, and we need to introduce, if necessary, through state intervention, a new form of state institutions that will direct savings towards the small, medium-sized enterprises. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. 30 seconds. First of all, we should reason in terms of ecosystems, alignment of stakeholders. It's small things that should go all together. And the second point that we haven't mentioned, if we want to have private individuals and if there are also tax relief and tax inducement measures, then we have to do something. Because it shouldn't be too complex, otherwise we lose people. Then something else? 3 seconds. I think that in terms of responsibility, there's a term that the Anglo-Saxons use. It's license, social license to operate. And I think that's the responsibility that we have. In French, our license to invest should be done in a way that actually complies with the society stakes. We should share values. We should have more parity, more inclusion. We should direct savings for growth, yes, but also for inclusive and sustainable growth. When we talk about directing savings actually for growth, it's actually an old subject, but bearing in mind the stakes of today, and now that we're aware of these stakes, it's more complex, it's a hot topic, it's actually more topical than it was in the past. I'm struck by actually this collective commitment that we all have. We have to intervene, we have to react quickly. It's true in Asia, in the US, in France. We have to change our habits, include everyone, investors, companies, governments, public authorities. It's only with this condition, if we move fast, that we can succeed. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for all your wonderful inputs.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to meet you again in Aix-en-Provence as we do every year. Welcome to this session called Deciding with the Stakeholders. It's true that you can't do anything in the world if you don't decide with the stakeholders. So we're going to ask our panelists the question. With the COVID-19 crisis, companies have undergone major changes and mutations, but they have new obligations. Management, workers, investors, shareholders, trade unions. How should we review the relationships between the various stakeholders? How can we distribute the work between the various stakeholders? In what proportion can economic actors make a decision together to maximize profit and get the best redistribution? How can we best decide including all the stakeholders in an uncertain environment? We'll talk about that with the participants. We have an English speaker on this panel, so if you don't speak English, I suggest you take a headset for translation. We have with us Oliver Wilde, President of AMRAE, Association for the Management of Risks and Insurance of Companies, with 1,500 members. They manage risk. And Oliver, you will tell us in what way managing risks is linked to our topic of deciding with stakeholders. Next to you, you have Laura Hartman from the General Labour Confederation in Sweden, one of the largest ones in Sweden, with the main Swedish trade unions. And traditionally, she is related to the Social Democrat Party in Sweden. Next to you, Lucy Bash, chairman and founder of an app called Too Good To Go, which relates people, retailers who have goods that are unsold at the end of the day, and they relate them, put them in touch with consumers. You will be the Entrepreneur Women of the Year. You will tell us about how your app works and how you can link profitability and the search for less waste in order to protect the environment. Hippolyte Marchetti, a partner at Allen & Overy, a major lawyer's office. You work especially in criminal law of business. And you work on compliance programs to fight against corruption, money laundering, anti-terrorist fighting. We have with us Olivier Pastré from the Cercle des Économistes. No longer need to introduce him. He will coordinate the session. And Olivier, you will start with a few words of introduction to present the discussion. There are 5 necessary transformations you will tell us. Well, thank you very much. First thing, I decided without Stephanie's agreement to change the title of the panel. Because decided with the stakeholders, I feel it's grotesque to talk about that. I think what we should say is to give priority to stakeholders. If you say deciding with the stakeholders, you get the impression they are the underdogs. So we will have a panel with no double Dutch, as they say. Every time someone speaks double Dutch, I will ring a bell. We're here to speak the truth and confront our ideas, and you can count on me to help you do so if you do not naturally tend to do so. We decided to look at the macro level and the micro level in order to make things easier, but everybody can reverse the 2 elements. So who are the stakeholders? Coming back to the topic. Stakeholders, or partie prenante in French, stakeholders in English. It's quite simple. We're talking about institutional investors like banks, insurances, pension funds. unions, obviously, and I would say first and foremost, associations. Obviously, we have an eminent representative of these union associations, consumer associations, and suppliers as well. We discovered with the chips and the wheat crisis that suppliers are a major part. We talk when we talk about stakeholders, it's full liberalism. It means parties like someone who has a stake, and also parties in the full meaning of the word. So 5 major and necessary changes. If I look at the topic of these rencontres d'Aix, transforming the world. Well, 5 transformations, 3 at macro level, economic level, 2 at the micro economic level. Macro level, first of all, you must give preference to the bottom-up approach, which is the reverse of what we've done for 40 years due to Keynes. Well, not everything should be thrown away in the top-down approach, but now we have to reverse this approach. And the base, so to say, must necessarily take power between inverted commas, because a top-down approach in a complex and globalized economy leads to a revenue, and this is not a good thing. We have changed our model. We have to live with Sully now, who invented the chicken on Sunday for everyone, for those of you who don't know. And the base must have at least 1 piece of meat a week if you want to have social cohesion. So no to Jupiter, yes to Sully and the intermediary bodies. Second transformation, we have to penalize short-termism. Obviously, we have to make short-term decision and take short-term action, but we have to stop the dictature of markets. The idea that companies should give a 15% return every year, quarter after quarter. Our friend who's an insurer will tell you it's stupid. Luckily, mutual insurances don't do that, but we have to stop having this weight over our heads, and we must penalize short-termism and short-term approaches. Obviously, as we see now, some people profit from the war, and this is not a good thing. Companies have to deliver profit that is at an absurd level at present. Third transformation, we have to condition any state intervention to the to a new start and a boost of the social ladder. There is no longer a social ladder. The great force of the 30 years after the war was the social ladder. The chairman of the Caisse d'Épargne started behind his desk in Sète. He started at the bottom of the ladder. This is no longer possible. The increase of the minimum salary is stupid, but returning hope to the youngsters is very clever. And there's still a lot to be done there. Participation, employee participation. Elizabeth told us about what she feels about that. It's a good thing. It has to be done quickly. We have to restore hope for the youth. So much for the macroeconomic level. For the microeconomic level, let's stop greenwashing in institutional investments. CSR, ISR. I'm not going to explain all these acronyms. They're impossible to understand. Very few people do this in a serious manner. Let's stop painting everything green. Let's get back to reality, really, and act. It's like a company with a mission. It's all very well. It means that companies' sole objective is no longer just profit, but let me remind you, I know that the chairman of Yves Rocher will kill me, but they still continue producing in Russia. Yves Rocher is supposed to be a company with a mission. If that is their mission, well, not so good. So let's stop this greenwashing at all costs. And one last point, I love you, you love me. Let's strengthen the power of unions. In Sweden, it's not perfect, but it's really good if you compare to France, where it's only 5% of people are unionized. We have fragmented unions that are not able to make proposals because they haven't got the means to do so. So they become more political and you can't discuss with them. This may be an exaggeration and a caricature, but you have to support the unions. I don't know, with an interaction with the wage earners or support from the state. I don't know. You have to support and strengthen these intermediaries between the workers and the company leaders, the management, and we'll see what we say in the last declaration of the rencontre. But this panel is the most important of the rencontre, as all the ones I take part. But because if we don't include these stakeholders, we won't make it. The state can't do it on its own. The consumer can't do it on its own. I take a shower and not a bath, but it's not going to change the planet. The state has to act, the intermediary bodies have to act, and the stakeholders have to take power, and we have to support them. Please don't speak double Dutch. Make proposals, real proposals. And at the end of the session, we'll have returned priority to the stakeholders, and we'll get rid of the present domination of the stakeholders, but stake being written S-T-E-A-K. Let's continue having stakeholders S-T-A-K-E. So, Stephanie, over to you. Well, you've put a lot of pressure on the panel. Olivier Wilde, you're chairman of insurers. No, sorry, Oliver, not Olivier. Same word, same name. One is in French, the other in English. Okay, how does this risk management, which is your specialty as an insurance man, how has it changed to integrate all these stakeholders with other issues apart from profit, like CSR in companies, without this greenwashing, which is a challenge Olivier talked about? Yes, I represent risk managers and insurers. Being a risk manager is an absolute necessity to help companies be sustainable and responsible. And I'll tell you why. We have a tool that Elisabeth Born mentioned yesterday, which is how can I anticipate risk and strengthen the resilience of my company when in crisis. But when you anticipate the risk, you anticipate opportunities as well. And this is very important because it helps us identify the challenges for the companies in the short, medium, and long term. Once this is said, and once I map the risks, I have to be ready to listen to people. In the beginning, we used to do this risk mapping with the internal stakeholders, like the executive committee, who would say, well, this is what can damage my strategic plan. Here are the objectives, more than financial objectives. And now people are expected to have a plural performance. They must perform at society level, at company level, for the workers, etc., more than at financial level. And for this, I have to extend the scope of my risk mapping to take into account all the stakeholders. I don't no longer discuss just with the human resources manager about talent recruitment and retention, but I have to talk with the wage earners, with the workers. I have to go and look for external stakeholders from the company. And this is the main change. And how did this what did this bring about? Well, we made a small survey in our association to prepare for this rencontre, and so that we wouldn't speak double Dutch. And we asked the risk managers, and 40% of the companies that were consulted have a stakeholder committee. They have organized a committee within the company that integrates internal and outside stakeholders to really face the challenges of the company. It is not greenwashing, it's an integrated and streamlined approach. And we see how the risk mapping has started. We've seen that through the resilience of companies when faced with a crisis. Those who have really mapped their risk properly have resisted better to stress and risk. If you look at the risk of a pandemic, for example, even if it hadn't been identified as such in the risk mapping, the supply issue, the talent retention, all this has been mapped. There is a problem to retain talents, and if you do a proper risk analysis, you see that the recruitment expectations are different from one country to the other. In Europe, for example, we were talking about that earlier, you have to give a meaning to the job if you want to attract youngsters in a company, otherwise you won't attract them. In the US, they haven't got the same consciousness or awareness. So you have to adapt to the location and to the expectations of the various stakeholders who are your clients, your investors, your workers. There's the thing that is represented by the stakeholder NGO, which is the planet, the climate. So you have to integrate the stakeholders, and in this way you can direct and improve the compass that you need to improve the strategy of the company. And if you do so, you're much more desirable for the stakeholders. Laura Hartman, Sweden is a country of co-management where unions are extremely powerful. You're at the head of the Confederation, which is one of the most powerful in Sweden. It's a culture because 80% of the wage earners in Sweden are a member of a union versus 10% in France. Do you think it's the best way of taking into account stakeholders to associate the unions to all the decisions?
Bonjour, that is basically the only thing I can in French, so let me speak English. Yes, as a chief economist at the Confederation for Swedish Labour Market or trade unions, my predecessors have actually been a part of developing this, what we call Swedish model. You ask my Finnish colleagues, they would probably call it the Nordic model, which I truly believe, and I like to argue that it has many of the keys to the challenges that we meet today with the green transition, and let me describe why. I mean, the Swedish model basically relies on 4 pillars. First, strong unions, as you said, 70% union density, high degree of collective bargaining. Second, a wage policy based on solidarity, meaning that the wages are set in collective bargaining not based on the individual firm's profitability, but rather on the productivity in the economy at large. And third, which is very important, a security in transition. In order to create acceptance for this model there, where we basically let firms that are not profitable die in order to move labor from these dying industries and firms into rising industry and firms. You need, of course, security in the transition. That means active labor market policies, education, training, but also a good insurance, unemployment insurance, and so on. And fourth pillar is, of course, the public education system and tax-financed welfare system. And all this together, they are mutually dependent, and they create a competitiveness, create growth, and also very low degree of inequality, even though that can be discussed. There are challenges in Sweden as well. But then I would like to add why I argue that this is good for this situation with the green transition. I think one thing that we indeed have heard at this conference, we've heard about the yellow vests. I know you French are very very familiar to that problem. We are discussing that in Sweden as well. What we need is acceptance. On one hand, of course, we need to make sure that the green transition happens in the industries, and there the states and the public do play a role with regulation and some making investments possible. But I think the most important thing is to really make sure that there's an acceptance in the whole country. And to me, the answer lies very much in the Swedish model. We have to make sure that people feel safe, secure today. Elections in Western countries, many Western countries have shown fear, insecurity, and anger instead of security. So really enhancing this kind of model, but you must remember, you must think it as a complete, mutually independent part. You can't just pick one of them and then believe that the rest is gonna go well, but you really have to think the whole system.
Voilà, on va voir si ça pourrait s'appliquer en France. Hein.
Well, we'll see if that works for France. Lucie Bache, your app, Too Good To Go. Just one word, says Olivier Pastre, which shows that their paradise may exist. Yes, says Stephanie, paradise, yes, but you have challenges in Sweden because some liberal reforms were introduced and go against this model, but you'll tell us more later on. Lucie Bache, your app, Too Good To Go, it's 6 years old. Tell us how it works. 60 million consumers. You touch 60 million people, 15 countries, including the US and Canada. 1,300 workers, quite a lot of retailers. Tell us how you can have a profitable economic model while your objective is to limit waste. Well, thank you and good morning. We started from an idea. I don't know if you know the share of food that is wasted in the world today. Today, we throw away 40% of what is produced on the planet. I learned about that when I was working for Nestlé in production. It was like a shock. I realized that our feeding model today, with the way we feed ourselves in daily life, was obsolete. So we launched Too Good To Go, which is a simple idea. I hear a lot of people saying, I had thought about that as well. So, which shows that it's not only important to have an idea, but you have to implement it. So we launched Too Good To Go, a mobile app which connects retailers who have unsold goods at the end of the day, and you and I, who come at the end of the day to recover the goods. So the person pays very little to the app and recovers 3 times the value of what they would have paid. And they recover the good, and Too Good To Go takes €1 of what you pay to the app and pays the rest to the retailer, which means that you have a real win-win economic model. The retailer no longer throws anything away and recovers a little money, and the people pay less. And we were able to create a company with quite a lot of jobs in 17 countries, because we also have the US and China. So the idea is to see how you can build a company model which has an economic model that will have an impact which is win-win, including for the planet, because waste represents 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions, so we can have a huge impact on climate as well. One word, because unsold goods used to be given to associations. Are you competing with them? Well, when I say 40% of produced food is thrown away, there is wasted food for everyone, really. we developed within an existing ecosystem. There were quite a lot of people who were trying to fight this food waste, and the idea was to complete their action. What you have to know is that associations very often come over and take big stocks of food. They can't go to every baker's who has 3 sandwiches and 4 loaves of bread left at the end of the day. And the beneficiaries don't eat all the types of products. So we come after the associations for everything that hasn't been recovered, and we give it to beneficiaries that are in need. What we realized was too good to go is that a lot of people are not beneficiaries of associations or donations, but they have trouble every month to get properly fed. So this is an example. We multiply their purchasing power by 3 because they can feed themselves via the app without going through the associations, which is difficult for them because going to the associations for food is a difficult approach and a difficult movement. And for you, the societal role of the company is something you had in mind after working for Nestlé? Yes, absolutely. I feel that companies are the most efficient vector to have an impact, really. And the idea is to put back money as a means and not as an end. And our role is to fight the food waste. But we need an economic model in a capitalistic world to have an impact, maximize this, and help a cause that is very dear to us. Our main measure of performance is the number of meals that are saved every day, and we save over 300,000 meals a day now with our app. Well done. Thank you. Hippolyte Marchetti, you're the lawyer in the panel. Can you pick up on what was said? Is there a change in paradigm? You have a number of clients. You try to align them with the new regulations. Are there good regulations that can include all the stakeholders? Well, I don't know if you should hate the word regulation. Coming back to what you were saying about speaking the truth, short-termism, bottom-up, greenwashing. I believe there's a virtue in regulations. As a lawyer, we advise a number of big corporations, and what we see in CSR is very often a transformation that is imposed, for example, because of the US and EU that are regulating everything with a taxonomy, classifying the bonds, for example, based on their sustainability, MiFID II, SFDR for financial markets. All these acronyms that no one understands, in fact. Yes, but things will be more and more regulated when you decide to have a financial product. Companies are obliged to publish their extra financial performance or non-financial performance, and it's going to get worse. I say get worse because I heard in other panels that a number of company managers were worried about the regulations. I think it's a good thing. I've only heard one word since the beginning of the rencontre was the house is on fire, we have to find a solution. What I note is what we need regulations and the means for the stakeholders like NGOs, unions, etc., to force a number of big corporations to change and to align, to comply. In France, you have a lot of actions that were launched against some CAC 40 companies, listed companies. There are a number of actions against criminal actions, for example, against DWS, the German asset manager. This was done in the US to quite an extent, but in France as well, we see quite a lot of actions and court actions and claims against major companies for putting Uyghur citizen at work or getting their supplies from suppliers who don't respect and comply with human rights. Well, there is no forbidding. It's not forbidden to use a product that has used the Uyghurs, for example. Then it's a choice that is made. There's nothing that is compulsory. Well, with these regulations, you're supposed to take care in your supply chain of what you do. And you make commitments, and if you don't comply with your commitments, you have a number of associations, NGOs or others that are working both in France and internationally with local victims and that present claims. More and more claims are presented. A lot of companies are under scrutiny to look at the contradiction with the principles that they boast and the reality. So there's more and more counterpower, and I believe people don't realize how much in the next 10 years, just as we did for corruption and the need to risk map, to map the risk of corruption, we see that the stakeholders will take more and more importance.
How can we fight against short-term visions? Because as Hippolyte was saying, we need to be more vigilant. Companies should actually be more careful in terms of their subsidiaries, who they hire. How can we fight against short-term vision? Because we talk about regulations, but companies need to give quarterly reports. When they're listed on the stock market, it's even worse. Short-term vision seems to be omnipresent in such cases. Well, the risk mapping tool is not a short-term tool. We've talked about increasing regulations, those that have anticipated the increase of regulations, those that have initiated already initiatives with committees for strategic purposes. For instance, they have anticipated that. They have not only identified a reputation risk, because everything can be a reputation. It's not enough. It's not enough to have a reputation risk, no. So this is why risk mapping is actually perfect, because we can identify all the risks that could damage the reputation. Once you do this work, understanding these risks is also having the means to see where we can do something and have a longer term vision. This is why we have companies. It's actually companies that are pushed to have mission-driven companies. So that can be respected or not, that can be open to criticism, because actually we have boundaries for initiatives. Yes, we have limits, but with regulations, this is actually a virtuous circle, and everybody is embarked upon it, and we have to give constraints with that. This risk approach enables us not to suffer, not to be a victim of all this, and to seize opportunities that are present. The fact that you were referring to trade unions being politicized because they have no means to act, and this is why we have a balance of powers here. What we have now with the transformation of powers with the stakeholders, we need to have a debate. We need to strike a right balance. We do not need to have a balance of powers to crush a company. We're here to help the companies do better. And do we have a culture in France for this? I think so. There is a change happening. You were talking about the obsession of having a growth rate that would be in excess of 10%. All the other stakeholders don't care about it. It's only the shareholder that would push for this. And the shareholder needs to be happy. Yeah, but if we want the investment to be sustainable, we have to reduce the share of profit, and we have to reallocate the money. That means that we can refinance transformation for ecology. We can take care of our employees. We have to take into consideration all the stakeholders, and then the company will be there in the long term. We have old companies that have been there for 150 years, and they are actually changing their raison d'être to be sustainable for a further 150 years. We have to take into consideration all the stakeholders. And if you don't do that, in 10 years, you're challenged, and you would be so already now. Would you like to say something? Yes, Hippolyte, I love you. But obviously, I don't agree with you. I'm not saying that I'm against regulations, but rather I'm against stupid regulations. And I'm going to take one example. in terms of risk measurements, insurers are prohibited from buying long-term, from doing private equity and from buying capital investments. That's actually, and there are also some banks that are penalized and they cannot finance TPEs. So this is actually a strong limit. We all want to be rich and in good health, but we have to make drastic measures and modify the regulations that are stupid. And there's actually quite a long list. And I'm going to say that the ASEC, which you glorified, actually created a lot of problems, and this has created a scandal. Hippolyte, do you want to react on this? I totally agree with what you're saying. Stupid legislation should be repealed, but there are some of them that go in the right direction. And this is what is very important for me. If you today you want the large groups to participate in this effort, and in reality these are the ones that have a power to do something, to go in the right direction, we have to give them guidelines, we have to give them some grammar, some structure. And this is what has been done. And we need the stakeholders, the ones we're talking about, have means of action and control. In France, this is what's happening at Geusvarien, a state that can be a bit confrontational with the media, with a reputation damage, where these large corporations have no choice. They have to comply with regulations. And we have to go towards a situation that we hope would be better. So how about Sweden? We know that it was very much ahead of time. This co-management was actually a model. It has been challenged because there were liberal reforms with a privatization of the education system, which surprised me, I have to say. How about the public opinion in Sweden? Is it more ready to have an energy policy that would be more protective of the environment than would be the French public opinion? Was the citizen included in this to preserve the environment? What do you think about this?
An interesting example. I think the picture abroad still is that it's quite heavily regulated with high taxes, and that is actually not the case. And you mentioned the schooling sector. I think you have always you have to ask where the profits and private companies are suited and where not. And I would say from the Swedish experience, which actually is very much the public opinion in Sweden nowadays as well, that the decision to allow multinational companies, profit-seeking companies into the tax, finance, schooling sector was a quite lousy decision, and it has really contributed to the problems that we have in the educational system in Sweden today. Whereas when we go to the green transition, of course, that is mostly crucial that we provide people with right skills to be able to quickly go from job tasks or works that disappear to those who arise, so that we can live up in the sort of the basic idea that the Swedish unions as well as Swedish employers say is that we are not afraid of new technology, we are afraid of old technology, which is based on the principle that we protect the workers and not jobs. But I think that it really starts on the firm level and on the working place level. If you want to make the union stronger and get up in the density, you really must make sure that workers are included in decision making already in the companies. We have lots of examples, both good and bad, in Sweden, where the digitalization has gone very smoothly. If the stakeholders applying the new technology have been included in designing how it should be introduced in a firm level, whereas those more top-down policies where you just put that new technology into hands of the workers really don't work. This is sort of it is a macro level question of union density and so on, but in the end it's very a micro level question of how you manage, how you lead the companies, and how you include the workers.
Lucie Bage, peut-être que vous pouvez rebondir sur ce que vient de dire Laura Hartmann. Alors vous avez organisé un pacte.
How about you? You have created a pact with the large distribution companies and the state, but since you're part of the digital companies, is there a way to organize companies in a different way to have employees participate? You have 1,300 employees. That's not the dimension of a CAC 40 listed company, but how do you make them participate in the decision-making process? That's actually a key subject. When you're smaller, everybody can say, but in 6 years, we went from a handful of employees to 1,300 employees, so it's become more complicated. We still want to empower, to give the keys to each and every one to make their own decisions on their sphere of influence. We have experts that are coordinated by a manager, but often experts are more relevant to make the decisions. And what is important for us is to define for each of them, for each of the 1,300 employees, to define their sphere of influence and to have some leeway to take their own decisions where they can. They have a framework and they know where they can navigate according to their expertise. And that allows us to go further. And we have no other choice anyway, because we actually have been a booming company. I don't want to be a bottleneck where all the companies have to go through the top management, because we can't move forward otherwise. It's very decentralized. It's as decentralized as possible. This is why we actually have so many employees, because we actually have some sectors which are actually managed as if they were individual dissociated companies. It can be also a problem because we lose synergy opportunities that can be essential. And we actually are spending a lot of time to know what should be centralized and what should be decentralized. But the problem is that we're talking about food. What is more local than food? May it be in Portugal, in Sweden, or in the United States. So all the time we have to strike the right balance between what needs to be centralized and decentralized. So quickly, the mobile app enabled to actually deliver more than 300,000 meals a day, but it's actually just a drop in the ocean in terms of food safety. So we wondered, how can we move further in our impact? How can we include the stakeholders, the large distribution companies, the consumers, the state? And we found out that the consumption dates are a problem. They're responsible of 20% of food waste, because people don't see when we say a preference date to consume by, and when it's not valid anymore, when it won't be good anymore, a valid date by. So the first one is a matter of hygiene for fish, for meat. This is actually something that we should respect. And the other one is just a recommendation. It's the best before. This is what we say in English, best before. That just means actually that the taste and the smell will be better. And very often we have 3 months actually. And this is not known by most people. And this is why we have a lot of stakeholders from the food industry, from consumption associations, to try to have 10 commitments to reduce food waste. And we've worked on this for 6 months. We try to explain on the packaging what it means. After this date, we can actually check it out. You can taste it before throwing it away. And a lot of people actually rallied around this pact. And we're trying to submit it to the Minister of Agriculture and Food, and also to the energy transition, because we wanted it to officialize. We wanted to officialize it, and with the 2 ministers, but also with the president of the Food Association, we also made it official. And we want it to be a standard later on, so that all stakeholders, but private companies as well, can actually do something, build matter, to make sure that the public authorities can actually have the right regulations afterwards. And with this in mind, did we actually launch some programs like how can we build a town where we can have an anti-food waste program, and also at schools, because we want teachers to talk about food waste because companies have an economic role, and we have to show that with these programs, we can change the society. It's a bottom-up approach, Olivier, isn't it? I'm actually depressed. It doesn't happen often. Why? Well, it's so wonderful what you've done that we shouldn't believe that the others are doing the same, actually. We often talk about greenwashing and so on. Yeah, we all agree. But that's a concrete example. And we're going to think, oh my God, she's wonderful. Her trick is great. Maybe people will follow you, but you're a huge minority and you really have to have other people carried in your wake. How about Russia, maybe? The idea was to give priority to the impact, but also to be realistic. But also our mission is to inspire and to engage. We're not judging people. People who, like me, are very climate activists. Very often you judge and saying, oh my God, you're taking the plane. No, that's not what we want to do. What we want to inspire. You can go to Brittany with a train ticket instead of taking the plane. It's important. We just have to talk about it. And with small steps, then we can have actually a big leap forward. That's what we try to do. We need to, this is why I wanted to have a company. I didn't want to be an association. I believe in the fact that the company can rethink itself to generate impact in a more efficient way than any kind of other potential stakeholder. We don't have much more time. Hippolyte, maybe you want to react on this proposal? I have 2 children who are actually believing that they're always sick and they will definitely not eat a yogurt if the best buy date has elapsed. So I thank you for all what you're doing. We just have to open the yogurt and check it out before throwing it away. We just have 5 minutes late, so do you have anything to say? So how can we influence the stakeholders? Well, the first thing for me would be to find all the measures that would help us get out of a confrontational state. As was mentioned earlier, that's the Swedish model, actually, as Olivier was saying. And in his introduction, the funding of trade unions is very important. We should fund them, obviously. I was part to a suit, Sauvagnac, for instance, who wanted to fluidify the relationships with the trade unionists. And there was a conviction, when everybody knew it, I think we should fund trade unions. I totally agree with this. There are a lot of things to do in terms of CSR. We should have people that should sit in CSR committees, but also on management boards. We should have more transparency, may it be for large companies, but also for small companies. We should go further than that in terms of manager remuneration. It should be indexed on the CSR objectives. It should be transparent. That should correspond to what the regulations expect. We should have actually have a better discussion with all the stakeholders. We have some time if you want to have a Q&A session. If you have any questions, we have 5 minutes left. I don't know. Is there any question in the back? Yeah, do you have a mic? And then on the front as well. Can you introduce yourself and ask your question? Hello, England Chenasso. I'm the institutional director of BAE. I would like to know how you structure the stakeholders, what the objectives are, and what are the measurements. We had an example yesterday with CMB that was explaining how can they talk about 6 stakeholders with 3 objectives per stakeholder, and that they were having KPIs for each measurement. Beyond this, what we're saying, and the importance of having stakeholders, how concretely are you going to do it? We know the structure, the legal structure of companies as they are, but beyond this, how would you actually have more stakeholders included concretely? Well, if you don't know how to do it, you can join my association. We are an association that actually is aimed at discussing on the good practices. But just to give you a few keys. First, I think we should map the stakeholders and identify who the stakeholders are, position them as regards to our business. That helps us actually have some introspection on the way our company is built, see who has influence on our work, to have the strategy of tomorrow. Once you have done that, we should include it in the identification of the stakes that would be material. We should integrate it in the risk mapping elements so as to associate them to our strategic choices. Depending on our size, of course, it will change. If we're smaller, we can have a more regular discussion, but if we're a larger corporation, the risk mapping should be done once a year, once every 2 years, and it's then that we should integrate the stakes, the expectations of all the stakeholders. And once you make a decision, you should actually check out all the decisions, if they are valid, with our stakeholders and have a strategy depending upon that. We should have a back and forth strategy, because when you're talking about KPIs, once you have fixed your objectives, we have to give a feedback, we have to give a report on this, because what we're creating is a matter of trust. We're trying to instill trust. We've talked about CSR capital, we talk about health capital, but now, okay, for environment, the environment as well, but now we also have a trust capital. We have to make sure that we preserve these relationships over the time and to have a constant dialogue with them. You have given the answer in your question. We have to measure, first of all, and then we have to track it. And there's also, maybe we need also a coercive part, otherwise we won't make it. Medias are important also. They have an important role to play. They are playing a very important role in the conveyance of information or knowledge, and there's certainly a lot of progress to make on this. There's everywhere we have progress to make. Laura, you have the floor.
You can do it in many ways, of course, formal or informal. One way is including union members, or even, I know in Swedish hospitals sometimes they have patients representatives in the board of directors, so you really do it in a formalized way. But to me, this is very much a design method, you know, service design. I don't know how much you use it in French companies, but that is quite a big thing in Sweden, at least now, really putting the workers, the employees who meet the customers or clients or patients or whatever you call this person that is affected by what you do in your company, in your organization, and the patients, the clients, together, and giving them a task to really come up with the answers. How should the work be organized in order to create biggest value? And this, of course, requires really power and willingness from the highest leaders in the organization to listen and to be open to changing the way the work is organized and doing things in a different way. But so design method and of course boards are two key elements for me.
C'est vrai que c'est très différent en France. Alors on me dit que c'était.
That's very different. I was told that it was over. Well, sorry, we have no time for another question. Sorry, it's over. Just one thing. Congratulations to Stephanie, to all of you. We've actually said that short-term vision was no good. We've actually mentioned everything that we should have. We've done our job, so goodbye. That's good.
Bonjour à tous, bienvenue pour cette...
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session about feeding people. I'm Dominique Seux from France Inter and Les Echos. Obviously, it's a very wide topic. It's true that it's a very changing situation. For the past few years, we had thought that the issues of feeding the global population was no longer an issue. It made sense. But for the past few months, we've seen that things have changed, including in Europe, which obviously was unexpected. And then behind that, we have the huge issue of climate change and the huge need for an action to take part in collective feeding, and with the big issue, how much can we pay for that? Obviously, we haven't got the same means in developing and developed countries. To talk about that, we have a number of eminent personalities. We have Caroline Le Poultier, Executive Director of Milk Products Interprofession, Hafez Ghanem, who's one of the vice presidents of the World Bank, in charge of Eastern and Southern Africa. He's French and Egyptian, and he will give us the pleasure of speaking French. Next to him, we have Cécile Belliot, who has been CEO of the Bell Group for the past few months. It's a family company with about 20 big brands that we all know, and about 4 billion in company. And we have Bernard Gault, who's CEO of Elio since, well, he's been so for the past 10 days, in fact. And next to you, we have Philippe Tillousbord. Thank you for being here. You're a specialist of these issues. He was also in the industry in the past, and he will give us the pleasure of starting the session by giving us a brief introduction. You have the floor, Philippe. Thank you, Dominique, for giving me the floor. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to start the session. As Dominique said, it's a big challenge that we have to face, this topic of our ability to feed the whole population of the planet in the coming decades. So it is this obviously the capping issue, which is that of climate, and we'll probably come back to that. But above and beyond that, if we want to have a look at the picture and get ready to cover the topic, I can see three challenges. First of all, the issue of demography. We'll come back to that. Another challenge about global exchanges of agricultural raw materials, which is something that is really changing fast. And there's another one, the third one, which is about the feeding habits of individuals, which have changed with the social transformation, and the food industry has a very big role to play. So, based on this, we're going to present the situation, and then we'll come back to a number of solutions. First, demographic challenge. You know most of the figures from the UN. 7-something billion inhabitants on the planet. That's an estimate. We could be 8 in 2030 and at least 9.7 billion in 2050. So this is a huge growth of the population, and this huge growth is obviously not uniform. It's not the same everywhere on the planet. If we were to summarize things simply, the strongest growth of the population will take place in Africa and in Asia, Southeast Asia in particular. In other areas like Asia, like China, for example, the situation will be different, which leads me to say that in some areas of the world, there will be a reduction in the population, and they will not have the same rate of growth. I'm thinking in particular about North America and Europe. For Europe, if you talk about Poland or Russia, which are really topical countries, the demographers predict a reduction in the population, and the same for North America. At the same time, you have an extreme famine which changes with the years. It is considered that at least 45 million people are in under extreme famine conditions. It's probably more, but at least there are 600,000 inhabitants on this planet who do not have access to a balanced feeding system. And then you have to have a look at the demography of the farmers' population. Will we have enough farmers? And amongst the farmers, you have some farmers providing food, and they use the local production and live from the local production, and you have to those who actually sell on the main markets to feed the planet. So this is quite a simple summary of the demographic challenge that has to be taken into account for the coming decades. Second challenge, as I was saying earlier, are the global exchanges of raw materials and agricultural materials. When I talk about agricultural materials, I'm talking about food, really, foodstuffs in general, talking about cereals, wheat, corn, plant proteins with soy, palm oil, milk also, milk powder. We'll hear the specialists later on. Meat, obviously. All this is at the very core of the discussion. So, all these products are of the essence. I should remind you that over the past few years, these raw material market has been a kind of oligopoly. There are very few countries producing these stuffs and selling it to the rest of the world, and it's a highly specific market. In the past, in the 80s, there was a kind of fight between the US and Europe, which would subsidize the productions to feed the rest of the planet. And at the time, the Eastern Bloc did not exist. But there have been changes since the opening of the Black Seas at the beginning of the 90s. We've been faced to global exchanges. And we are faced with quite a lot of health crisis, climate crisis. All the crises impact the whole global market. And my last point, well, you have less than 3 seconds. It's the challenge of food habits and food regimens, food diets. and their transformation. And we'll talk about that because 70% of the consumption of meat, or rather the consumption of meat, will increase by 70% in the coming years. Thank you very much. I didn't mention Andrea Celi earlier because he's in Italy and he's live. Sorry, sir, I couldn't see you earlier. Thank you for being with us. You're the chairman of the company that bears your name, Eli Cafe, which burns and produces coffee. But right now I'll give the floor to Hafez Ghanem from the World Bank to tell us about the challenges, the actual coming challenges for the next few months. Each of you will have 3.5 minutes, and you have a clear clock. Okay, I'll try to make it, but it's going to be difficult, says Mr. Ghanem. Well, thank you very much, Dominic. 3.5 minutes to try and describe 4 points. Dominic and Philippe mentioned the challenges, the challenge of food safety, and the challenge, in fact, the most important food challenge at present, it takes place in Africa. Yesterday, I was looking up at the last figures of the global alimentary program. 105 million people are under acute food stress. And a few years ago, it's a huge increase because there used to be 30 million not so long ago. If you look at the Republic of Congo, it's 7 million. If you look at Chad, Mauritania, Madagascar. So, in short, we're faced with a huge food crisis, especially in Africa, and these are the figures from the World Food Programme. This acute food crisis, people tend to think that it's due to the Ukraine war. Well, the war in Ukraine has made things more complicated, but it's not the actual cause of the crisis. The causes of the crisis are multiple, and there are several of them. Let me mention 2 elements. First of all, climate change, especially in Eastern Africa, like Madagascar, for example. We've seen locust attacks like they never had before. We've seen droughts, cyclones, and where we didn't invest sufficiently to make African agriculture more resilient, well, we are now facing problems. And there are human causes of human origin, like wars, conflicts. If you look at what's happening in Sahel, in Mali, in Ethiopia. So what you're telling us is that we're facing a situation that is deteriorated for long. Yes, I'm saying that there are structural issues that we have to face. And the war has made the situation more complicated. Because of the increase in the price of foodstuffs, for example, in some countries in Africa, the prices have gone up by 50%. But there's another issue, which is the reduction in humanitarian support. Because everybody now is concentrating and focusing on Ukraine, not only at political and economic level, but also at financial level. huge budgets are being redirected, and this obviously has a negative impact. There's also the problem of the price of fertilizers. And next year we'll have another problem in Africa because the farmers do not have access to fertilizers. And I'd like to underscore the special case of North Africa, where major countries like Egypt or Tunisia are highly dependent on their imports. Thank you. Well, as you will have seen, everybody will talk about the challenges and then we'll tell you about the solutions. This way, we're sure you will stay with us. Cécile Bell, what is your view of the major global and national food challenges? Well, I believe that when you talk about food, rather than talking about a challenge, I like to talk about the value of food so that everybody understands what it means. Food is health. It's the health of your children. It's your health. Today, 800 million people are obese. 800 million people haven't got the right food diet and are deficient and are lacking food. 2 million people, as you were saying, do not have enough to feed themselves. This is the challenge of their health. Food is the challenge linked to climate. I don't know if everybody realizes when you talk about climate. This morning at 10 there was another panel, and every time people talk about climate, but they only talk about energy transition. As a company, I don't know how I can move this, but maybe as a company, but not as an individual. But food, agriculture, all the way to the plate, that represents 1/3 of carbon emission. It's more than all transportation. When do we talk about this topic? Individually, I can change what I put in my plate, on my plate. And this is up to me. The third challenge of food is the well-being of those who nourish us and feed us. Personally, I don't feed anyone. I don't feed anyone because if before me there is no farmer, nothing will come to the cities to feed the world. And today we have a real issue because these people are not only not paid the right price, and on top of it, they're no longer recognized as important. There is the challenge that we tend to forget. If we do not get to the next generation of farmers, we won't feed anyone in the cities. And the last challenge of food is animal well-being. If we are concerned about the way the animals we eat are treated, this will be good. Some people see it as a challenge. I see it as a real value. What is the price and the true value of all that? And this is how we should ask the question. And I believe this is something we should talk about more often, more in the media, more at school, and then it will be part of the solution. I feel you're upset. You clearly feel we're not talking sufficiently in the public discussion, in the media. You feel that you're really understating this. Yes, because everybody has an impact. It's incredible. Every day you go and shop for your food. If you know what's behind it, if you're able to make the right choice, tomorrow morning you will change the situation for your health, for the planet, for animals, and for farmers that feed us. When will we have the proper debate? When will we help each one of us to make the right choice? Well, good message, well conveyed. Bernard Gault, Elior, well-known collective catering group. Well, I would like to thank the Cercle des Économistes for giving us the occasion of expressing ourselves. And as you can see around the table, there are ideas and there are convictions. I'm not going to add much because when you have these challenging topics, when you speak last, most of the challenges have been mentioned. But I would indeed like to tell you how I see things. To me, the angle is that of the consumers. The consumer seen as our clients. We have 3.7 million of them in the various countries. And what I'm interested in is the attitude of our guests and the challenges that they have. And the first one is to help them see things differently. You talk about obesity, just one figure in the US. The caring for obesity would lead to doubling the consumption of fruit and veg. So you get an idea of the challenge, really. Obviously, there's the issue of proteins, of sustainability that my colleagues have mentioned already. The second issue is that we're going to find different sources, as Mr. Ganem said. It's not just the famine in Africa or Asia. It's Asia and Africa as places of production. What can we do for that? Let me give you an example. The price of energy is very important because if the price of energy were to drop, not easy at present, but if it were to drop, Africa could become a major agricultural producer. Third topic, you have to produce food and sell it differently. We haven't talked about it, but we have the issue of transparency, traceability, fertilizers. What do we do if we produce differently? There's a probable drop in the margins of intermediaries because there'll be more transparency. So that's a major challenge. And the last point, which is more of a public policy issue, the rules for trading will be different. With the intervention of governments and subsidies, and with these four challenges, we can cover all the discussion, I believe. What does the catering market represent in the market for food consumption? I haven't got the figure in mind. I would say that in France, we feed 1.1 million guests every day. It represents 30%, I'm told here. So you have some power in the choices you make to get the market moving. Yes, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the solutions. Caroline Lepoultier, you're in the dairy profession. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Last year, I was lucky enough to be able to testify here about the approach of societal responsibility, CSR, of the dairy producers. And I was, when I was coming out, I saw someone, a farmer from Cantal, a cattle breeder, who said, but I feed people also, not only in France, but in other countries. And this is very important because when you look at things, the situation has changed. Let me explain how the dairy sector can help face the challenges and what are the challenges that this sector is faced with, especially with the carbon issue. In France, we produce milk, we process it fully, and we export 40%, 30% in Europe, 10% in the rest of the world, and we contribute to feeding the population while helping some rural areas to live, especially breeders in France, and over 700 companies, both SMEs and huge corporations who are flagship companies of the dairy industry at international level. These companies, we've talked a lot about reindustrialization over these past 2 days. These companies are present in France. The milk or dairy companies cannot be delocated like many in the food sector. And we've seen it in the defense of food sovereignty. Some sectors, for example, in the COVID crisis, were able to get organized so that consumers had there was no products missing, and to get organized. But it's a sovereign sector, and it's not a word in vain. This had to be built, and we had to secure the channels and not just focus on local elements. So the two challenges we're faced today, and this has been mentioned quite a lot, quite at length over the past 2 days, is the attractiveness of the sector, of the jobs. Cécile was saying it earlier on. There is not enough value given to the jobs, the products, the stakeholders, the retailers, the restaurants, the supply, the deliveries. So you mean the demography in the dairy sector is reduced? Yes, it's dropping, and the working conditions, the attractiveness, and also breeders retiring, and you have quite a lot of jobs in the dairy sector, which are in villages of less or communities of less than 15,000 people, and a lot of jobs are still vacant. How much are breeders paid for a liter of milk? We pay 412 euros for 1,000 liters. And elsewhere? You mean in Europe, in the world? No, I'm saying on a scale from what to what, really, depending on who buys the milk. Well, it depends on the time, because we're in a period of tension, of price stress, and stress on global production. This is an inflationary period, especially, and also for the product price of milk. And we have to make sure that it's still accessible, because this is for daily life. According to WHO, you should have 100 kilos of dairy products per capita and per year. And more than half the population do not have these. So second challenge, and I'll come back to the examples later on, is carbon. So obviously this is being discussed at length. For milk, you must have cows that emit carbon and methane. And there's been a program that was launched in 2021 with a low-carbon program for the dairy sector. Yes, you'll help explain how you can decarbonate cows. Mr. Lee, you're with us. Can you tell us about the stakes of the coffee sector? You're in Milan or Rome, I don't know.
Yeah. Can you hear me? So coffee agriculture is 25 million families in 40 countries. And for all these countries, it's a matter of livelihood agriculture. So we need to have enough margin, because they receive less than 10% of the final value of the coffee cup, which is consumed in the OECD countries, the northern countries. And there's a wall, actually, that is represented at the equator level. There's a significant problem, namely the impact of climate. For 20 years now, at least, we could see how the coffee was impacted by the climate change, may it be in terms of drought, temperatures that would be too high, or torrential rains, all that would cause damage, because the coffee culture requires to have restrictive climate conditions. And another consequence of climate change is that up to 50% of farmland for coffee will not exist by 2050. So in 2015, there was the greatest celebration worldwide of coffee with the Expo Milan 2015, which concentrated the Universal Expo for the first time in the world on food. And 40 producing countries were actually present, and Jeffrey Sachs, produced a publication called Milan Coffee Legacy. So we have established that there's a virtuous circle that relates the well-being that coffee gives to those that consume it with the development that is being created for those that produce it. And so on paper, the aim is to feed this virtuous circle with more quality and sustainability so as to improve the well-being and development for all stakeholders. The study that we carried out is on the adaptation to climate, where we try to understand whether supply safety could be found despite the impact of climate change. And we understood that despite the fact that we have a concentration in less countries, there is a possibility to increase productivity and to produce more coffee without adversely affecting the climate. And that's a good sign. We have identified what the stakes were. First of all, we should change the agronomic practices. And secondly, we should have varieties that are more climate resistant. So it's a wide program that requires migration of coffee culture in terms of altitude and latitude, where climate change is less severe. And also, I will talk about mitigation, because we need to decarbonate here as well. As we all know, agriculture is also very responsible for the climate change. It's a victim of it, but it also is responsible. And the loss of biodiversity comes from that as well, in a way. Just a word, how do the coffee costs evolve right now worldwide? Well, because of climate, we have had 2 important droughts in Brazil last year, and now prices have doubled as opposed to 18 months ago. So this has actually an important impact on the economy. Thank you. So challenges have been determined, and Cécile, I'm going towards you first. An industrialist like you, what do they expect from public authorities, from also the other stakeholders, to make things evolve in the direction that you wish to have and that you mentioned with a lot of energy? What kind of tools should be used in emergency? First of all, there's a responsibility of each stakeholder. Retailers, farmers, the state, because when we talk about food behavior, the state has a role to play with via the education system. We have to find solutions, and we can do something, each of us. And they're quite simple and straightforward. And if I were to sum them up, there are 3 of them. First of all, there's the agriculture. We have to deal with regenerative agriculture. What does it mean? When agriculture is intensive, it exploits the soil, and then the soil doesn't play its role because it has become too poor and it doesn't capture carbon anymore. A soil that we respect, that is healthy, where there's microbiome, where the worms play their role, then carbon is captured. And so you can see that when we change agricultural practices, it can become an important leverage. But you cannot ask to a farmer, to a breeder, when he doesn't know how much he earns at the end of the month, to transform itself. It won't work. It won't work. You can't demand that from them. So if we do not guarantee a decent wage at the end of the month, nobody will move. I'm going to give the example of Bell, but I'm not here to promote Bell. I'm just talking about the stakes. Before the food general states, we actually had the price of the milk that was fixed in France, where we said, what is the minimum that you need? And above that, what did we do? We put a premium to have actually have a pasture dairy, pasture milk, because this is important, where we have healthy milk, and then to have non-GMO milk, not to feed the crows with GMO, because we wanted to actually feed the cows as they should. 80% of the feed of cows in Europe, it comes from Brazil. It doesn't work. And they've done it, the breeders. They've done it in 1.5 years. So how about the consumers? Because the prices have gone up. So do the consumers follow you? Of course, it costs more. We have to do our share. And then second element, the food behavior, the food consumption behavior. Well, I'm going to give you a few figures. You all should know about it. In the G20 countries, why am I talking about the G20 countries? Well, because as for the others, the developing countries, they should have access to protein. It's important for the brain to develop, for children. So when we talk about a problem lies with the G20 countries. It's actually Asia, because they are vegetarians. If we switch from 10%, 10 portions, we should have 1 out of 10 from animal protein. We should switch. What we would actually save in terms of carbon, it would be the equivalent of Japan emission. It's 40 years of water emission from London. What do you mean switching? We should switch to a vegetal protein. We should talk about alternatives that we find on the market. There's a lot of them. We should switch to leguminous plants. So if we switch just 1 out of 10 persons, that's actually the economy of 40 years of consumption of water in London. And then we can use this for other things than to feed cattle. And that's the equivalent of the surface of the United Kingdom. And we have no choice but to change, because if we do not change, if the emerging countries adopt our food regime, then we would have an excess of 230% of the Paris Agreements in terms of carbon emissions. And then there's also food waste. There's actually too much that is thrown away. 70% of what is wasted in the households. So once again, these 3 leverages, we know them, and we all have a role to play to make that known, to communicate on the fair value, and to promote a good food system. Because otherwise, if we adopt ours, it will cost more. So what could you do in your catering service? Well, I would like to talk about our trades, have some advocacy for it. I have listened to what Cécile has said, and of course I totally agree with what she said. What I would like to suggest to public powers and in general, to a public at large, is to have a partnership. We could be the spearhead of the initiatives and to be the warranters of social catering, because we have an undeniable expertise of how to handle raw materials, commodities. We know how to do it at the fair price. We know what is good for the health. And actually on this aspect, we are actually having an important experiment in Spain and France on the education of young children on food regimes, something which we do for free in your schools, in our schools. We can actually find the right guidelines to what is good for the planet in the amount of 20%. And we can have also inflation amortization instruments with good meals. And we can also decide together, collectively, on the right production and supply chain. We can't do that on our own. We need to have a partnership. We need that our customers, which are public authorities, companies, and so on, clients, these clients should help us to do our job, may it be in the public or the private sector. But I think we can be very efficient and we can give a lot of impetus in this and we can speed up these changes as Cécile has explained. Thank you. Thank you. Caroline de Poutier, you have the floor. Yes. Amongst the solutions, and that's actually the asset that we have, because we have actually a stream system like for the agricultural system, we can share among all the links to the distributors and to the others the challenges, but also the solutions. I wanted to say a few words on attractiveness. I would like to insist upon carbon, the attractiveness of our stream, of our sector, industry. If we want to continue to produce better tomorrow and more tomorrow and to keep this willingness to export outside so as to keep our territories, we need to hire new talents. And we're trying to have innovative initiatives such as the one I'm going to mention. It's important to promote new territories, new models. There's actually a breeder from Isère and an influencer that never got out of his neighborhood. He was invited to go to the farm and they had gone down to the sofas. They had done a barbecue together in the city and it was actually very friendly. And they saw that it had actually induced some kids to enroll for an agricultural school. And that is good because people who might not have any contact with each other, they should actually meet around products, around values, around sharing values. And that's what is all about in our stream. And as for the carbon impact, I could talk for hours about it. We had a product that we had actually launched during COP21 10 years ago. We should have a common collective stake like this, and we need to have a benchmark that would be common. And this is why we actually drafted this benchmark. For each breeder, they should actually measure their own progress in their own farm. And then afterwards, we can have a ranking and we can have a dialogue with the NGOs. That's the last part of what I want to say. We should also share more with all the stakeholders. The environmental protection NGOs are one of them. And this is what we're going to try to do it in the Sarthe. We're going to bring NGOs there to show all the progress that has been made in terms of carbon impact mitigation. Thank you very much. So, do you hear me? Yeah? Can you hear me? Yes? Yes? So I totally support what was said by the CEO of Bell Group on regenerative agriculture and the change of nutrition. Because to have a good climate change mitigation approach after 2015, I actually wondered how we should decarbonate our industry, because this is what we should all do by 2050. And since 2/3 of the carbon emissions from the food industry and coffee come from the agriculture, and bearing in mind that the agricultural part is also that can sequestrate carbon with regenerative agriculture, as was mentioned, we can have a carbon negative outcome. If we complement it with natural reserves, we can have an agricultural and ecological approach, which is also promoted by the World Food Organization of the UN. And this could be actually improved with natural reserves so that we could have more biodiversity, more water resources, and also have a reduction in terms of temperatures, because we would create shade and there would be more evaporation of plants. And this is why I actually decided to embrace a virtuous agricultural model, because we can have insects, we can compose parts from the industry, we can sequestrate it in the agricultural part, And we can have an approach where we can have circular decarbonation, which is the opposite of offsetting. It's not a matter of offsetting with the sequestration in other streams. This is not what we want to do. So the third pillar is to have the IPCC has always recommended for a co-benefit. That's health, actually, because if the bet is to demonstrate that all products that are cultivated in a regenerative way are also healthier. There's also an immediate response, which is quite straightforward. Bearing in mind that regenerative agriculture uses less agrochemicals, there'll be less residues, and that would be healthier for our health. But the bet is also to demonstrate that there's a higher percentage of components that are good for the health, that are beneficial for the health. We know that the biodiversity is important because we create phytochemicals that are good for the health, that are anti-inflammatory, antioxidants, and the concentration of these phytochemicals, which are good for the health, are higher if we have regenerative agriculture. We also have experimental plantations in Ethiopia and Guatemala that were actually made to study these phenomena. We are trying to study all the ins and outs from a practical point of view on these coffee plantations, and we try to transmit the knowledge to all the coffee cultures on these clear practices. And from an analytical point of view, we're starting to prove that some of the components of coffee that are known to be responsible and good for the well-being of those that produce it, because we know that when we drink coffee, we actually live longer. These components are more present if this coffee is made in a regenerative way. We can listen to you for hours, but unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I have to give the floor to Fiescade, but I would like to see the number of questions because we'll have 10 minutes to ask questions. How many will we have? 1, 2, 3. Okay, Afes Ganem, you have a few minutes to talk about the recommendations worldwide. There's a lot of things that we could do at the world level, but I would like to insist upon 2 points, because unfortunately we're running out of time. The first one is everything that my colleagues said, mitigation. Mitigation is necessary. I'm giving the example of Africa. It is responsible for less than 2% of greenhouse gas emissions, but that's the continent that suffers more in terms of problems related to climate change. So that's an important point. Then second point that I would like to highlight is the importance of investing in agriculture in the South and in Africa especially. We should invest there, not only because we need financial needs, but we need also transfer of technologies. This is important to improve agriculture, to have a more resilient agriculture. And then I have to say that I've been working for many years, and I can see a net drop in Western investments. Everywhere you go in Africa, you'll see Chinese investing. You'll see Indians, Turkish people investing, but French people are investing less and less. Same thing for Germans, for British people. And so, this is something we have to change. That's a very clear message. something that we should actually... So Q&A, yes. Questions and answers. To whom are you asking the question? And please go straight to the point. Thank you for your inputs. I would like to react as to what Mrs. Bellow said. I totally agree. Food industry is not well represented nowadays, but as a consumer, we don't have a lot of information to have enlightened decisions. We were talking about eco scores, for instance, but I think that industrialists have the responsibility to transfer some of their knowledge on carbon captation and sequestrations for consumers to be more enlightened. Answer. I totally agree with that. And this is why when we were talking about solutions, the state can play a role, the schools can also play a role. We could, depending upon balanced menus, depending upon the carbon emissions in schools, in local authorities, in universities, and so on. I don't know if you know how it's the media investment that are put each year to only talk about prices only. So we wonder why every time we talk about food, we talk about price, because this is the only thing we talk about. If this investment should be 1/3 and we use it to have the right choices. Coop, for instance, is the leading distributor in Denmark. Do you know what they proposed? Since we all have loyalty cards, when they shop there, they all have the information, all the data on the average basket that they have bought there. And what is pushing consumers now, depending upon their basket, they say, okay, this is how you could improve your food, your nutritional basket, because you've bought fatty products or sweet products, and they're even giving recipes, and also they're giving the carbon impact. This is why we have leverages. Philippe, one word on that. One word. As the president of Malim, which is aiming at setting up a data set on food, on nutritional quality that should be reliable, because there are a lot of mistakes that are being made, that are being committed on these large public data such as Nutri-Score, for instance. We have some reluctance today, not coming from Cécile Belliot, of course, but from a lot of industrialists and also with GMS. So I really like the question, and we should do a lot of things with the media, because law should be abided by. A common good exists on digital data accessible to all on food, and they should be reliable. We'll go quicker because we have 7 minutes left. Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. I would like to go back to the presentation that Cécile has made. You've said that agriculture is 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, but I would like to specify that according to the UN food, to the FAO, we should actually be more efficient than buying bio-local when breeding, cattle raising actually requires a lot of water. You say that we should switch. What did the panel think about the alternative on cellular agriculture and the production on alternative agriculture? I think we should end at 12:10. So are you unhappy? Why are you unhappy? The public is unhappy about finishing earlier, but we'll definitely obey. So a sentence for each of you. Yes, obviously we should have a more vegetal regime. Half of the plate should be only fruit and vegetable. We have to help people. The problem about food is a matter of culture. And since it's cultural, we've been used to it, but there's a lot of alternatives, but we don't know how to do that. We have bronze, and with their bronze, actually, it it gives the consumer the willingness to buy. Obviously, we have to reduce the impact of cattle raising on climate, of course. We should do that. We should give access to Africa to the protein that they don't have. And us, as a wealthy country, we should also do our part. We should actually offer savory, tasty meals and education. So my wrap-up sentence is that we should give an enlightened decision, a choice to everyone, and take care of carbon captation, soils, the animal and vegetal nutrition. I would like to say two things. One point only. You can't imagine how much pressure I have on my shoulders. I agree. It is a matter of culture. It's cultural, the way we eat. And especially here in France, there's animal protein everywhere. And I know that Philippe Telesbourg has set up an initiative on this point for the development of vegetal, of plant protein. Thank you, Bernard. Well, in a nutshell, Elior and the companies engaged into corporate catering are all partners, full-fledged partners. We really are committed, and this will make a difference. I would like to give the floor to Philippe for the wrap-up sentence, and then we'll give the floor to our Italian friend. I would like to talk about plant proteins. If there have been successes, it was because there was a program for this in France. It is now shared at the level of the European Union. We now have a European plan, and as was said, we are negotiating with Africa, between Africa and the EU, to have a plant protein program with Africa. And in this plan, obviously, there is a necessity to enable Africans to develop their own plant proteins, but also their animal proteins, because this the essential part of growth for meat, it will be essentially done in Africa. And then you have heard that this will require a lot of innovation, upstream innovation. We need research. The food industry will bring it as well. We are at the core of the centers of concern of the Cercle des économistes, and we need training that is fundamental, may it be in Europe or in Africa. That will be my last word. Thank you to all of you for having listened to us. Thank you.